This is AB Model Crafts, Alex speaking, and I'm here to talk about these wood propellers. Somebody had asked me to explain how I do them, and I thought, sure, why not? I mean, I'm no expert, and I will say that, when I do these, there's always a little bit of a trade-off. They are not going to be perfect by my hand, but I think that the look still is better for me than a painted propeller. And for what it's worth, I always make 2 or 3 at a time because, like, this is close, but it didn't quite make the cut. The pattern gets off if your wood carving is imbalanced. So you got to have a matching pattern on the propeller, at least pretty darn close. And by that, I'm talking about when you make the laminate, if the propeller is carved and sanded equally, then those stripes will be pretty much even. And I still think this is better than a paint job. So, it'll go on a less important model. But what I use is I use white oak. These are 1/16 of an inch thick. I use white oak veneer and I use walnut. And sometimes I use different woods, but this particular wood grows around the forest where JASTA 65 airplanes were stationed, so that's what I'm using. And I'm going to cut these into strips thusly. So now I've got the blanks ready, and you might notice that I've got some variations in the direction of the grain. I think that gives the thing a little bit of strength. So, it's not like I'm really rigid about that because it's mostly about the color. But ultimately, these propellers will end up paper thin. So you have to, or, as thin as a thick business card, say, in certain areas. So it has to be as strong as possible. So now that I've cut these blanks, I'm going to put some 5-minute epoxy on it and let it sit up. I'm actually going to let it sit up for a full 24 hours, even with 5-minute epoxy, because 5-minute epoxy needs 24 hours to fully cure. All right. Okay, I used the JB Weld Clear Weld 5-minute epoxy, and I glued usually 5 layers each of the dark and the light color, and then I put a piece of tape on the outside to facilitate the clamping and also to have a nice clean palette to trace the shape of the propeller on later. So now we're going to clamp this sucker down and let it dry. So for clamping, I will take 2 pieces of wood and put that around the outside of the veneered glued together pieces, and then put the clamps on the wood so that it applies even pressure. While the wood is setting up, you can start getting ready the prop boss. What you do is you take a sacrificial prop from the kit, and if you're like me, you probably got a gazillion extras. So the wingnut wings kit, those props are not all the same. There's subtle differences in each one. And the ones that I like to use are thicker ones. Like this one here, the base of it here is paper thin. This is, you can see, it's got a little bit more thickness to it. That'll come in handy later. So as part of that suspension of disbelief, I am going to allow the improper prop boss if that gets me to my goal of having a real wood propeller. So to prepare the sacrificial prop boss, what I do is I take a small drill about the same diameter. I see these holes here. If you look at a real prop boss, it's going to be, you can see the wood through it. So before you do anything else, you got to go around and drill those babies out. All this can happen pretty quick. And etc., etc. And then usually what I'm going to do is I am going to, sorry my leg's shaking. I'm not a pro here, so my camera work either. So I'm going to whack off part of that prop. And then I'm going to come in with my saw and I'm going to carefully cut that prop off. Prop boss, I should say. I'll come back to this in a minute. It's at the halfway point of the prop boss operation. I'm left with a rough hewn prop boss, and I'm going to go around it with sprue cutters to remove some of that extra cheddar. And once again, one slip here and you're just going to start all over again. So one thing good about the camera is you can actually, my eyes actually are starting to fail, so I will zoom in with a magnifier glass and make sure I haven't flattened any part of that boss. And then I get to start in on the elbow grease. I take a black sanding stick, which in my professionally organized studio here is right over here under this pile of stuff, and I'm going to put that on the table, a workspace, and we'll lay that baby right on there, and I'm going to sand it. Boop, 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 boop. So after you get the prop boss separated and drilled out, it should now start to be looking like a prop boss with the holes drilled out. And then at this point you're kind of going for the final shaping. So I would carefully, I drill out the back of this thing enough to where I can insert an X-Acto blade point. And then I'm going to put against an abrasive, and I'm going to rotate it because otherwise you're going to get flat spots. So rotate it for the final shaping of the boss. Take a look at it. Looks pretty good. So now that it's more or less round with the typical imperfections of something done by a human, I'm going to take it down the. So once I've got it drilled out, rounded, thinned, and it's still probably just a little bit too thick, but that's okay because I want it to stand out, or you know, it's hard to tell, but it's ready for paint. So I put on a piece of tape, and this is the benefit of actually using the camera to zoom in on something, is because I can see I actually need to go down a little bit more. So when you're doing your final sanding, it's important to rotate this thing. So you got to kind of not create, a flat spot. So I'll do 3 or 4 strokes, and I'll rotate that sucker. Because at this point, you're talking about something that's pretty darn thin. Okay, it's ready for paint. For my shiny stuff, I like to use the Rust-Oleum Metallic. It's non-model, therefore it's cheap and it lasts a very long time. Flute, and that's pretty much it. Prop boss is ready for the wood. Now I'm at the point where I'm getting ready to mark the blanks, the blank with the shape of the propeller. And this is where you really want to study a couple of points of this propeller to help avoid mistakes like on this this finished dud here. And some might wonder why I bother finishing it, because it is still a fine looking prop, and it's going to look fine on a Rodden or something. For me, it's still acceptable and looks better than a painted prop. But where there's some flaws in this, actually, mostly come from just making haste. So when you're studying this prop, getting ready to do your shaping, you've really got to notice this arc here, the radius of it, and also the kind of the dainty waist. And then also you got to kind of plot out in your mind the shape of the thickness of where the boss is, and that taper. And so some propellers are going to have an angle to it in relationship to if the prop face is totally flat, then the angle of the blade has got a little bit of a almost twist to it. Is that the right word? But there is a difference between the front and the back of the propeller, and the best way to really get your plan for shaping this thing is to look at where you've got to remove material. And on this particular prop, if you really study it, the back of that propeller is almost concave. So it's very super thin and almost concave. So I start to get the shape by laying it down on my blanks and simply tracing it out. At this point, I've got the shape of the propeller onto my blank, and the next step will be to take it out to my scroll saw. And if you don't have a scroll saw, you can use a Dremel tool. There's the blanks, epoxy dripping out of it, and that's actually kind of what you want. You want to make sure you've got those suckers. So when you epoxy this wood, it is important to have it really solidly glued. And the temptation when I first started doing this, and I think it's kind of natural, as you think, well, I'm gonna glue a whole sheet of this together, and then I'll just cut these blanks up as I need it. But what happens is that then it gets a lot of warp in it. And you can notice again the alternating grain patterns on even the wood that's the same color. So between the alternating grain of both shades of wood, both types of wood, and then making sure everything's thoroughly glued. And even though it's 5-minute epoxy, you're going to let that sucker sit up for a full 24 hours, because in the middle of this glue is not fully set up. Here in the edges where the air's got to it, it's fully set up, but when you start cutting this, it'll start to delaminate because of the vibrations of the scroll saw blade. So that's I'm going to wrap it up for tonight. I will continue this video tomorrow. I'm not the type of guy that can do a bunch of editing, so I've got this marked. I went ahead and marked this one on the wood. Normally I use tape, but this is on the wood. And I've got the cut lines, if you notice, extended past the end of the propeller. And that's because in the way I remove wood for the shaping, it's better to leave that extra so you don't end up shortening your blade. So in other words, if you cut it to the exact shape of the propeller, then as you're thinning it, it's going to keep getting shorter and shorter and shorter. So what you want to do is actually cut it long, so as you're doing your shaping and your thinning, you save that final cutoff shaping for the very end. Right, I've got my two blanks cut out, and a lot of times I will cut one a little bit tight to the line and one a little bit loose, and then I put them through the same shaping process, and then I pick whichever one is better. But there you can see the laminations. So you want to have the propeller that you're going to match, and then I like to have like a visual reference. So I decided I'm going to do the Naindorf propeller, which I have. This is from Lifelike decals, and this is the wrong scale. But what it does show is the pattern of the wood, what it's supposed to look like. So you kind of got a guidepost, and as you shape the propeller, the canter, or the torque twist of the blade, is what reveals the shape of the wood. So if you're cutting it properly, this is just how it turns out as a natural byproduct. Now, about 25% carving this one. And on this one, this method, and I do mix it up, I am trying to do with the Dremel tool mostly. So I cut it out on the bandsaw, and then you can notice that the propeller is, I stop and trace it periodically. And then the other thing you got to pay attention to is the angle of the blade in relationship. It's hard to see, but you can kind of see that either side it's got a little bit of a thing to it. And so mistakes happen, and these curved shapes are a lot more difficult for me to make right now. So usually what I'll do is I'll start off with a harder one, and then when I start to lose it for whatever reason, I've got a couple of choices that are smaller in profile than this propeller. So actually, rather than just toss the whole thing, I regroup and then change now to the wolf or axial propeller. And actually, this type of propeller is probably the easiest one to make, because the ends of it have very little of there's a term for that, I'm not sure if it's cant or whatever, but the twist of it in relationship to the flat face, there's not much to it. It's a dainty little blade. It's very narrow in the waist. And so I'm going to keep working on this, and wood grains coming out, the patterns coming out. So stopping and reassessing, sometimes the piece will get abandoned. and or you change shape and you just keep plugging away on it. I'm probably about 45 minutes into this one. So one of the key things is whatever tool you're using is that you've got to remove the material equally. So key is counting your strokes as you're sanding. I'm using a Dremel tool, and so I'm still in the rough shape, so I'm doing 20. And then rotate it. Rotate it. Rotate. So that was 20 strokes on each 4 sides of the propeller. And then probably for the 4th time, I'm going to retrace the shape of the propeller blade. Because part of what that does is so I can draw on the propeller, you know, the side that I want to remove material. And then, so you can, after you do your session removing material, take your thing, eyeball it good, mark on there parts where you want to remove. One note is the importance of leaving extra material at the end of your propeller. As you notice, it's kind of fat at the end. And what happens is if you cut that the exact shape, you know, every time I do this, every pass I make, the end of this gets a little shorter. So if you start off there, you're going to lose a significant amount of material off the very end of it before you go. I'm getting closer. Stop, reassess, mark high spots, start sanding, counting my passes, 20 per side. Okay, getting closer, and note about movement about the material again. Well, there's the sanding stick. You got to take your your movement all the way through. In other words, you can't sand in the middle. You got to do directional strokes, removing material, counting your strokes. And then you kind of get back in and you reassess, because you're at this point, you're trying to ascertain if you've got something that's going to be a propeller or if you've got a tosser. And usually at this point, you can go either way. So I'm looking at the thickness of the blade. I'm looking at the relative twist to make sure they're matching up pretty good. And the width of the boss area on the kit prop, it's fairly rounded, so now I'm going to start to thin out and shape right around the thing here with my Dremel tool. The blade taper, the taper from the narrow point to the centers of the thing, I've had the best luck on that, cutting that in with a black file, and I usually got the piece laid down on the desk in front of me so that I can kind of reference it as I cut. Now at this point the blade is quite thin, so it's going to shape up pretty quick. And I'm already not super happy with this one, but I'm going to keep working on it just because I'm kind of showing the process. And also, everybody wins all the time. I certainly don't win all the time. And by that, I mean you're going to have situations where you're just going to toss it. And that, my friends, is what makes it good. Because if it was easy, everybody would do it. But actually it is easy. So at this point, it gets hard to see kind of where you've got to remove the material. Overall, shape's pretty good. You kind of see I gotta clear out some more out of here, so work on what is now the back of the propeller. So I'm pretty sure this one didn't make the cut. It's awful close, but I ended up losing a little bit too much thickness on the blade. I mean, the shape's not totally perfect. It's tough, you know. I'm gonna keep working on it, but hard assessment shows a little bit off on the length, so I'm gonna looking at it here, so this is where we're looking for the patterns of the white grain. I've got the dark grain on a stripe going at both sides, and then the light grain and then the dark grain, so it's pretty even. I can't afford to take out any more material. The blade is straight, and the cant of the blade is good, but I feel like I removed just a touch too much to where I've just about lost the shape. So it is what it is. Took me about 45 minutes to get to this point, maybe an hour and a half, and it's still almost too close to call, so I lost part of what happens when you're trying to do this fast. So it's like it's either it goes fast or you gotta start over again, but a little bit of a nick of the blade right there from the Dremel tool. So, but overall it's pretty okay. It's not going to win any prizes. So going to head through the finish steps, even though the Dremel model I don't think will make the cut. It's still got some finish work to go, and I usually will go ahead and take it all the way You can kind of see the angle of the blade. So when it ends up just a smidge off, see, that's about, this one's about flat and this one's got the twist to it. So, you know, this thing has got 2 points of failure on it. It's got that twist didn't turn out consistent. It's got this little nick in the bottom side, and my pattern is slightly off. So all in all, this won't make the cut, but that's okay. So I've already got another blank cut, because usually this is why I do it batches of 2, is because I'm going to actually go through the whole process with 2 propellers, and even a third, you know, I mean, if I gotta, and so the other method that I will do tomorrow, I will do the same process. I start off trying to make this more complicated shape, and tomorrow I'll use my normal method, which would be to use a scary angle grinder. And you know, I mean, I think that by thinning that blade out, so I've still got a little bit of angle that actually, now that I'm looking at it, there's enough meat on that to where when I thin it out, I can't get it to focus, it's actually I'm gonna probably just about even up that cut, so you can see one side to the other. So it's off, but I have got extra material on the top of this one to remove. So once you're at the kind of 90% point, you want to take and you dunk your propeller in sanding sealer. Shake that baby off. Doop, 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 doop. And maybe you can put it over a trash can. Give it a spin to get the excess off. And then we're going to let that sucker sit for 4 hours, which means we'll pick this up again tomorrow. And as we're doing the final shaping on this probably reject, I don't think I can save it, but you know, we'll see. Then I will try again with the more complex curved shape of propeller. We'll see how it goes. And now finished carving. Finally, 3rd time's the charm, and I ended up with the Niedendorf as my propeller. So at this point, I'll lay it down on the table. Niedendorf sits pretty flat. Got a little bit of taper left I can put on the tips. And other than that, that's a wrap. So next, actually, I can see here that one of these needs to be thinned out a little bit. So final sanding, final detailing, here we go. Now you can see that the tips, the curls at the tips match. So at the very end, you just remove the material equally to bring out the shape of that laminate. She's paper thin, but because of the mixed grains, it's really strong. I mean, Not that you couldn't snap it, but that's the angles. Okay, let's do some finish fine sanding and then clear coat.